I am very excited that today for our CCS Friday, in this time of Advent and looking forward and up and around us, we have Natalie Wiggs Stevenson and Ben Mangini. Natalie and Ben are both at Emmanuel. Natalie is a professor there, and Ben is a doctoral student. And Natalie and Ben, feel free to say more about yourselves if you would like. And I'll just mention that a few years ago, I had a wonderful opportunity to work together with Natalie, and it's a time that I remember very fondly, and I'm particularly happy that Natalie and Ben are here with us today. So, Natalie, over to you.
Actually, Ben, I think we're over to you. Is that right?
I think you start, or did we switch them?
We switched, but I
We
can
switched.
Yeah,
Okay, I'll start.
Guys, we're super well organized.
Very well coordinated, everyone.
It was very smooth. Yeah.
Okay, I will start. So there is a truth in the world of academic theology that most of us recognize, but few of us talk about, and that is that most of our book covers are really terrible. The design is often created by people who have not actually read the book. Authors have little control over what is chosen, especially if the book is published as a part of a series. And so here I've illustrated sort of what I consider my cardinal sins of bad theology book covers. And that includes graphic techniques that are outdated from the 80s and 90s, stock photography, rudimentary color blocking, pervasive use of mosaics, stained glass, sculptures. I know at least 3 books from the last 20 years that have used that exact same mosaic of the Apostle Paul on their cover. The representation of the book's themes, when attempted, is often hyper-literal and simplistic. Covers are not meant to enhance a text. They're meant to either sell copies by easy recognition or to be extremely cost efficient. And this has caused me frustration for years. So finding myself with some spare time during the pandemic, I decided to have some fun with it. The result was a found art project that combined theological book titles with pulp sci-fi artwork to create a series of new covers. And I've shared a few here. You can find the full collection pinned at the top of my Twitter feed, which is linked below. But probably the most accessible is that Tumblr link, which has them all just on one page together. There are 107 in total. And I've shared Coakley, Moltmann, and Altruist Reed here because they're major conversation partners in Natalie's book, Transgressive Devotion. And then I also included The Interior Castle just because it's one of my favorites from the series. These covers don't just depict a part of the book, but they play with the ideas and they show them to us in a new way, and maybe, I hope, force us to rethink something that we took for granted in the book. And when I first posted some of these covers on Twitter, the response was often something like, this should be the new cover of the book, or I'm going to print this out and tape it to my copy, or that type of thing. They caused a reaction. First, of course, because they're entertaining, but also because I think some of these covers are actually doing the work of theology themselves. The effect was not just to depict the main theme of the book or one of the several themes. The effect was to restructure and represent the often familiar content of the book with the disruption of this pulp sci-fi genre. And my hope is that these images were able to open up something new in the text. Indecent Theology was criticized, and there's no surprise there. It's always been a controversial book. But one person told me it was too straight, too heterosexual, too vanilla. I saw this image as containing themes of bondage, kink, costumes, 3 partners, and an interspecies affair, not exactly vanilla, but it provoked a conversation on Twitter about what Altruist Reed was actually trying to do by searching for the divine among the people that had been labeled indecent. The Crucified God by Moltmann, the book itself wants us to consider a God that is present in real suffering And that's an idea that has sort of lost some of its novelty in the many decades since it first came out. But the image of this terrifying and imminent God monster figure, I think helps us recover at least some of the shock of that original text. So with the original batch of covers that I created, I had also made a cover for Natalie's first book, Ethnographic Theology. And then when it came time that she was preparing to release Transgressive Devotion, I asked if she'd like a cover for her new book as well. I gave her several options that I was working on, and she actually selected 3 that she really liked. We couldn't narrow it down. And so we're going to reflect on those 3 covers today. And at this point, I will turn it back over to Natalie.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks so much for having us here today. It's a real joy to get to connect with you at the end of the semester and do something kind of fun. So I'm going to share a little bit with you about how my project in this book, Transgressive Devotion, came about. I entered the process simply as a lover of art, and particularly performance art, which isn't talked about a whole lot in theological writing. And as I was trying to figure out how to engage art theologically, I felt like I had two main ways that you could do it in traditional theological writing. One was to use art to represent certain theological concepts, and the other one was to take artworks and reflect on them theologically. Both of those tend to limit the artworks with which we might engage to specifically religious works of art. And in my own life of faith, that's not really what art had done for me or how it had worked in the ways that I relate to God. I had done my undergraduate degree in art history and had found that the work I did around performance art had a really significant impact on my theological imagination, perhaps especially when it wasn't explicitly theological. And the way that it did that was that it continually restructured the ways I perceived and encountered reality and daily life. And so I became interested in the theological possibilities of this. A lot of my work is around theologies and daily life. And so I kind of wanted to work thinking about how art can connect with that. So one of the starting points of the project comes from, and there's many, but one of them, the one related to art, comes from Jacques Rancière, the philosopher who writes about aesthetics and his understanding of the political function of art. And for Rancière, the political function of art is to rupture and rearrange a social imagination. So for Rancière, art's not about political art is not about, or not even political art, sorry, art's political function is not about representing what's broken in a society to us. It actually works to rupture our perceptions of a society so that what's broken becomes visible in the very process of its transformation. So art in its political function creates the conditions for societal transformation precisely as the mechanism for revealing the brokenness. And so that got me thinking about how art and everyday practice, the work that I've done is based in ethnographic research as well, how art and practice both have the power to rupture and rearrange our theological imaginaries. And so this book, Transgressive Devotion, hangs on a traditional systematic theological frame, simply to give it a robust structure within which we can move and play. And using art and engagements with everyday Christian practices, not to launch an argument, but to try to generate a performative aesthetic experience that functions almost liturgically in terms of invoking God's presence, God's redeeming presence among us in the act of reading it. Every time I say that, it seems like just a ridiculous goal. Nevertheless, that's what I was going for. So in the book, each doctrine, so I cover 6 doctrines: Father, Spirit, Son, Church, Salvation, Humanity. Each doctrine opens with a description of a performance artwork that had significant impact on my own theological imagination. And each of those performance artworks is not intended to illustrate the doctrine, and the doctrine is not intended to interpret the art. Again, those artworks are there to open the doctrine up, to break it open, and to try to rearrange it into something new. So the place where we thought, so that's the sort of general introduction to both of the projects. And so, yeah, so Ben is my doctoral student, and he came with these covers, which are just, to my mind, brilliant. And we began playing now with the conversation between his covers and this book, which has been now quite, at least for my theological imagination, so the next stage of generative collaboration in this project as it unfolds now beyond the book into a new performative space. So that's where we're coming from. And we thought it might be a good idea to take a breakout moment and give you an opportunity to think together and partners about when you have had an artwork open up a new way of looking at the world for you. So again, thinking along the lines of Rancière's political function of art, not when you have engaged in artwork that has just represented or shown something new to you, but a moment when an artwork maybe has actually ruptured and rearranged your perception of reality or of society or of your own theological understanding. A moment when an artwork has just so ruptured you that you get rearranged anew in your engagement with it. This might actually look like. And so Ben's going to kick us off.
The first cover that I'm going to share uses artwork by American sci-fi artist John Berkey, who's probably best known for doing some of the first promotional images for the first Star Wars movie back in the 70s. This cover recalls actually the earlier cover, which you'll see here, that I created for Ethnographic Theology. And that cover depicted ideas Deserto and Sherry Ortner, the ideas that sort of undergirded the ethnographic work she was doing in ethnographic theology. It includes the performative aspect of the book, but also the crisis of faith, to which Natalie wrote this book as a response. And it's meant to kind of evoke a feeling that transgression is in some ways a crisis, and the explosion is a riff on what Natalie is actually doing in her theological performance. It makes a text more visceral.
So the book opens with me sitting writing my dissertation, and it's in 2010 when Marina Abramovich is performing The Artist is Present in MoMA. And MoMA is projecting a live stream from the performance. And unbeknownst to me in that moment, less than a year away from moving to Toronto to begin my first real academic job, I was in the midst of a number of positive life changes. I was beginning to feel as if I had finally figured things out, as if I was making good progress on the path of integration I still desired. But of course, I wasn't so integrated as I thought. I'd really only found one way to arrange the pieces that would work, until it too didn't. And what I was failing to see in that moment was just how much ministry and academic theology had become the primary stages upon which I was performing my Christian identity, upon which I was performing my faith. I'm still not sure if it was the already years-long experience with infertility that my husband and I were experiencing at the time, or the repeated waves of my undiagnosed mental health concerns that were crashing their way towards the tsunami of a full-blown mental illness. But the more I came to professionalize my Christian faith, the more that faith seemed to sever itself from who I was as a human being. Ministry and academia should have provided scripts that could direct my ways in times of trouble, but seemed to make things worse. And then one day, I woke up and realized that I no longer believed in God. It's not that I became for defining a life of faith. And in the aftermath of that morning, I wasn't thinking about belief. I was thinking about hope, the most desiring of all theological virtues. Or better, I wasn't so much thinking about hope as I was reaching towards it. I hoped those old stories, those old doctrines, those old scriptures could still become true in some way. I yearned for the fragile conditions in which my desire for God might be illumined by the presence of hope's spirit. It's hope that endures all things as we wait. hope that shapes our yearning. What I perceived as losing my belief in God was something else entirely. It was a negation of my knowledge of God, not a negation of what I knew, but rather a negation of my knowing. It was an invitation to stop searching and instead be found. I perform these scripts of doubt and hope so often that I now hardly need to consult my lines. Internalized to my flesh, a simple gesture, a downturned gaze, a hand on my hip can set off their improvisation. Over time, they too have become the affective structures of my ways of being. I think I've arranged the pieces of myself in the right order. Then, like dry leaves, they're scattered by the wind. For a moment, I'll cohere, become transparent to myself. Only I don't want to be disordered, incoherent, and fake. Almost no one does. And yet the God who I long to proclaim doesn't work with the straightforwardness I crave.
This next cover uses artwork named Jabber. Jabber is a contemporary artist. Theological experience and insight are assembled by the theologian artist into a work of art that is recognizably Christian in the way that it fits together and the image of God that it portrays. Natalie's turn to performance in transgressive devotion stops trying to assemble or describe an image of God, and instead attempts a kind of theology that conjures God. The character in Rainbow doing a backflip makes this performative element explicit, as well as nodding to sources in queer theory and queer theology, and especially themes of queer temporality. The silhouette of the head contains a number of images that evoke elements of fantasy: erotic, kenotic, masochistic, God's fantasy and ours. These are fantasies that we are invited to enter in the hopes that God will become present. In transgressive devotion, these fantasies are not necessarily declarations of divine attributes, such as a God with Alzheimer's or the Holy Spirit as a type of STD. Rather, the book and this cover are an invitation to fantasize with these images.
There's an arrogance to the ascetic's assumption that she can lure divine desire. Perhaps even more so if we assume that God plays the role of a BDSM scene. There are certainly theologically fruitful avenues to pursue by putting God in this position. But this isn't the scene we're writing here. God's desire is always prior to human desire. The ascetic's desire is therefore a replication, consolidating, and thus continuing divine desire as it returns to its source. The ascetic mirrors the Son as he mirrors the Father, each one translucent to the other in the kenotic overflow of power. To have the mind of Christ means participating in God's own kenotic fantasy, as it's performed on, with, and through our bodies. God is not a sadist in this scene. He's the primary masochist, teaching all of us what power and vulnerability can be. God's fantasy is the fantasy of erotic ruination. God was so lonely in the self-sufficiency of his own autonomy that his desire created limits against which he could push. And push he did, building and intensifying his desire until it became insatiable. Recognizing the explosive value of unreleased desire, God got quite literally creative. Trading self-sufficiency for self-transcendence, God made himself the object of his own desire. He made himself a man. Self-projections are not always a bad thing. In fact, God called the Adam of his image good. And when this particular fantasy of self-emptying failed to come to good fruition, God's desire wasn't dampened. It was only intensified, reignited by the chase to find another way. Because as we all know, that first Adam didn't quite work out. First loves rarely do. So God made himself man after man after man, each one a different projection of his fantasy, each one performing a repetition that could consolidate or displace God's desire anew. Each man's ruin taught God a little more about what it was he actually wanted, until he became able to make himself a man once more, but this time really make himself a man. In the second Adam, God's desire for erotic ruination passed from fantasy to reality, took on flesh, and was undone. Here God got what it wanted all along: autonomy not as self-sufficiency, not even really, or at least primarily, a self-transcendence, but rather fundamentally a self-negation, poured out into a completely unexpected yet terrifyingly intensified revelation of God in flesh. Pressing up against the limits of skin, sweat, and hair, the borders between creator and created were shattered in the masochistic fantasy of incarnation. Life, and then death, and as the story goes, then life once more, but not quite yet. God's body, both in the flesh and in the church, and in their brokenness and ours, the story of God's ruin keeps on being told. The eternal caught up in faulty fantasies of redemption.
For the last cover, I chose an untitled artwork from Zarfin, an illustrator ubiquitous with sci-fi novels in the 1970s, who has also been featured on the pages of Fortune magazine, Playboy, and Penthouse. I selected this painting as a depiction of transgressive devotion's final fantasy, Marina Abramovic and artist Josephine Decker disrobing and then embracing. The theologian is an artist in this parable, writes Natalie. Although transgressive devotion takes the shape of a systematic theology, it is at its core effective, and this is a part of the devotion that it depicts. Natalie says that this kind of performance theology is like a prayer, and so in this performance art, the vulnerability and even indecency of the theologian or the artist allows God to appear. In this image, the artist takes on an angelic appearance, and the painterly style blurs the subjects so that they begin to meld together. Are they two theologians, a pastor and a parishioner, two lovers, two artists, God and human, God and God's self? There is nudity, but the sexuality of the image really depends on what you bring to the image from your own imagination. The question of vulnerability and power hangs over the entire scene.
This one's a little longer, so get comfy. In these pages, I've tried to deploy all these theological approaches in ways that animate affect. Instead of using them to launch an argument, I've tried to perform them in ways that are vulnerable, erotic, and undoing all at once, terrifying and perhaps in the end, a marker of my own imbalance. My performance of faith is in many ways the misfit of any given role's constrained restraint. Such limits do not deny, but rather produce the substance of things unseen. Faith is not the rabbit pulled out from the magician's soup pocket. It is the abundant overflow of a cup that will always and almost by necessity remain too small. It's not the proverbial coin stashed between the cushions of a sofa to be unearthed. It is instead the deviant cry that erupts from a script carved into flesh left uncontained. The performance of Christian faith is the slight misfire by which all other performances, and even its own performance, begin to break down. Not the gem of truth that's hidden within, but rather the subtitles of a three-penny opera, reminding you that none of this is real. Faith turned to devotion is both the sum of these pages and their remainder. The words on these pages cannot pretend to be objective, but they aren't entirely subjective either. My own ad hoc context-specific ways of being a Christian in this broken world are always running circles within and around the spirit who I'm chasing. If I try to hold them back, then each word I write in these pages would have the power to displace the word in my life. Keeping this voice present in the text has been a highly tricky task, precisely because the ways that my faith transcends my academic theological commitments are kind of embarrassing to admit. Academic theology, strangely enough, leaves little room for exploring experiences we might call supernatural. But my faith has continually performed on and through many of these. They are, in fact, some of the strange moments of devotion that can't be contained within these pages, and yet towards which their transgression yearns. There's no universe, as far as I know, in which I could write in a scholarly way about the time I heard the audible voice of God, for example. The times I've been caught as collateral damage in spiritual warfare, or the spirits who have visited me briefly at the borders of asleep and awake. Indeed, even now I'm tempted to write the time I thought I heard God's voice, the time I felt caught up in the battle between good and evil, the time I mistook the borders of consciousness for something else entirely. But when the light or the darkness or the silence is just right, when a nightmare continues for a split second past waking and I feel enough of a weight upon my chest, I might spend a minute praying, and not in a mindfulness way to calm myself down, which I might do with an app on my phone, which has been clinically proven to have neurological and psychological benefits, but more instinctively and definitively for the protection that only comes through the blood of Christ. I've stopped my car in the middle of the street at night to dance and shake out my fingers, the energetic overflow from God's Spirit rushing through me. You can take the girl out of charismatic Christianity, but you can't take the charismatic Christianity out of the girl. Modern, rational, and decidedly less magical academic theology exiles these oddities from its canons for reflection. Still, when I traded my capacity to speak in tongues for a doctorate, I didn't quite know what I was giving up. Transgressive devotion is, among other things, my yearning in each and every direction as an attempt to get it back, or at least to find a new way to perform it. Performance understood this way reframes the negative connotation of inauthenticity to emphasize instead that we all live in the gap of our own becoming. We are not yet who Christ is calling us to be, so who we truly are is always unfolding as a curious theological experiment. We are not so much already made in God's image as we are being made into it by it, even as we look at it through a glass dimly. I am free to live as if I am saved because I have died with Christ, but I won't actually live with God fully, that is face to face, until I've shaken off this mortal coil. My fragmentation doesn't mean I'm inauthentic. It means that I'm human. And this might be the precise form of humanity from which theology needs to be written. Academic theology hasn't quite come up with the frameworks for analyzing these oddities yet. That doesn't mean they don't contribute to its production, or that it doesn't likewise contribute to theirs. In the aftermath of the day I stopped believing in God, I prayed the only prayer adequate to the task of facing the void. My God, why have you forsaken me? Echoing from the Psalms to the lips of God, God's self, and up through my throat, across my tongue to mix with moisture-hitting air, the path of my return to God had to wind its way back to the foot of the cross. The metaphor of performance disrupts the hegemony of an academic text just enough to write this theology as a broken prayer instead. A prayer that takes us into, out of, and back into unknowing once again and again and again. These pages are full of old stories, doctrines, and scriptures that have shaped the faith in my bones and that I hoped could come to feel true once again. The unwanted guests, the tongues with which I've spoken, the ecstasies and unraveling that have brought me to both pleasure and destruction. These are the stubborn ghosts that can't be exorcised from the theological traditions I'm performing. Each one a forgotten deja vu that's both assault and inspiration, caught up in the swoop of God's desire. So we have another question for breakout rooms, if that's what you would like to do. And our question is, what is a subterranean paradigm shift that's rearranged your theology? So again, not a new theological idea that you've engaged that has changed your faith, but something that operates underneath the whole structure that holds your theological understanding together. What's a paradigm shift that's happened at that level that has changed the way you encounter the divine?